Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for attending today's webinar on ACA Digital Outreach, Lessons Learned and Best Practices. My name is Matt Henry. I run the healthcare practice for Audience Partners. We'll talk a little bit about what we do. But the purpose of the webinar today is to show you what we've learned in the first month of outreach to the Affordable Care Act audience, and also some tactical best practices that we think you can implement in your own campaigns to make them more effective. Just a little bit of logistics before we start. As you see in the console, there are multiple windows. On the bottom panel, you'll see multiple buttons. You can actually hit those, and they will pop up. For example, questions and answers, but also the presentation window itself, which you can resize. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to ask. What I will probably do is wait until the very end to address questions, leave about 15 minutes for that. And if I cannot get to your question, our intent is to follow up with all unanswered questions at some point after the webinar. But we will jump right in. So today's agenda, a couple of points that we'd like to make. First, just to talk a little bit about Audience Partners and what we do, specifically around the Affordable Care Act, which is one of our major focuses here. Then we'd like to talk about the Affordable Care Act myths and opportunities. So that's really just sort of a summary of things we're hearing from exchanges and private insurers and agencies on their behalf, how they're thinking about things right and how they might be thinking about things wrong in the era of the Affordable Care Act. Then we'll show you some analytics that kind of describe what we've seen so far. And then we'll get tactical and say, based on what we've seen so far, here are what we believe are best practices and how you can maximize engagement, awareness, enrollment, specifically to the Affordable Care Act audience. When we planned this webinar, 6 or 7 weeks ago, it was prior to the launch of the Affordable Care Act and the exchanges specifically. So obviously what's been dominating the news are things like, technical issues and political obstacles. So I will put that caveat in place. There are a lot of big issues surrounding this. It's very early on, but we do have some early results that we'd like to share with you today. So we will jump right in. First, just a couple minutes about Audience Partners. Again, I run the healthcare practice within Audience Partners. We are a leading provider of data-driven digital marketing and advertising services. We have built what we call NHX, which is a platform HIPAA compliant that essentially includes data around specific healthcare audiences connected to a series of publishers so that we can get messaging to very specific audiences across online channels. So that includes display, targeted mobile, online video, also to some extent addressable television is possible. And we can serve our ads specifically for the context of today to uninsured individuals by segment, not just correlative demographic groups. Some things that we don't do, for example, we don't do email, we don't do direct mail, we don't do linear television buys, but as you'll see as I speak through some of the following slides, we're always aware of those because we believe that a multi-channel approach is the right approach, and we can synchronize our digital efforts with offline efforts in some very tangible ways. And what we've seen so far is that provides lift on all tactics. So our general approach is synchronize with those tactics. The premise behind Audience Partners, as I mentioned, is data-driven. So again, we've got specific data that speaks to uninsured. We can segment by age, ethnicity, % federal poverty level, geography, plus many, many other factors. But the value of the data is twofold. One is that it helps us with targeting. So we can eliminate a lot of the waste, and I'll talk about sort of how that manifests itself in other types of campaigns. But we can also segment messages to different groups. And we've seen good response, for example, when we target a younger audience or a Hispanic audience or an audience in a specific geography with a specific message, we see better results. The other benefit of data that we see is on the analytics side. So we'll spend some time today showing you some example analytics. But the idea is that we can measure multiple variables very quickly in an online environment. It takes days, not weeks, to see results that we can act on. So we can optimize across specific audience segments or demographics, of course, site context, time of day, day part, frequency, all of these different things. And I'll show you examples of how we're doing that. But again, central to our approach, and we believe central to a successful approach, is the use of data. So our clients right now, we're running multiple ACA-related campaigns. We're in 41 states currently. Our clients include federal and state exchanges, private health insurers, and advocacy groups, each of whom is looking for a specific uninsured audience. Our data set is completely HIPAA compliant. We have a compliance officer here to make sure that everything we do is not only compliant with HIPAA, but also compliant with online privacy. It is a concern that is raised many times, but we're certainly very aware of that. And the last bullet here is that limited waste, that our value proposition is we limit waste, we have better targeted reach, and we can yield better results. So the graphic at the bottom kind of shows this. You know, if 1 out of 6 people roughly is uninsured, we only serve our ads to that person so that we're not, wasting any ad impressions or wasting any clicks or wasting any downstream conversions. Sometimes I neglect to include this slide, but for people who don't understand the notion of data-driven audience targeting or behavioral online targeting, this is what we do. So rather than say, we're going to buy an ad on Philly.com, or we're going to buy an ad on this particular article which is about fitness and health, which certainly we can do, we would rather focus on the who. So in this case, that's an uninsured audience, and this one very specifically, an uninsured female, age 34, married with young children in her household, above 400% FPL, so there'd be a different message delivered to her in suburban Philadelphia in this case. And we can also overlay attitudinal data that says this is a person who's likely to research health information online, purchase a health product online, things like that. So in aggregate, we have 15,000 attributes, many of them very specifically focused around Affordable Care Act. But the idea is we can define an audience very specifically. So when this person goes to Philly.com, she will see your ad here and or there. And if someone who was, for example, sitting in the house next door to her was a 75-year-old who already had Medicare, that person would see something different on the same site at the same time. So the idea is we can be very precise with who sees an ad, where they see it, when they see it, et cetera. And we'll talk about all those dimensions as we go through here. So just some things that we've seen over the last really 10 months or so when we've been focused primarily on this. We've had discussions and sometimes debates with multiple health insurance entities, again, state exchanges, insurers, advocacy groups, but also agencies on their behalf. And we're running, several dozen campaigns right now targeting this very audience. So we've really kind of thought about this, and what I wanted to highlight on the next few slides are some things that we're seeing that we think are probably misguided thoughts and ways that we think that you can correct them. So myth number 1, ACA marketing is fundamentally the same as traditional individual healthcare marketing. We should rely on the strategies, tools, and tactics that have succeeded for us over the last several years. I have heard very senior health insurance execs say this very thing. I have heard experienced agency executives and media buyers say this very thing. We disagree. We believe that the ACA market is significantly different on many dimensions and requires a different approach. There are some fundamental similarities, obviously, because the products are similar, and we can certainly learn from what we've done before, but we can't simply copy and paste what has worked for individual healthcare acquisition and assume it will work for the ACA market. So some of the differences that you see, again, it's a new audience. In addition to the 40 million plus uninsured, there are potentially millions more uninsured to be, and depending on what cable news network you listen to, that number could be as high as 10 million already in terms of people who have individual plans that have been canceled because they're not qualified. So the market's big, but even that 40 million is just a small segment of it. As we think about the real ripple effects of this and the real scope of ACA, we need to think about small business and the disruption that shop exchanges and employee choice will provide, but also large businesses. As I'm sure you've heard in the news, companies like Walgreens have decided to push their employees to private exchanges. So that has implications, and it's really just symptoms of a major shift that I think everyone on this call can see towards a more consumer-focused health insurance marketplace. So when we talk about consumer-focused, that's where we, Audience Partners, talks about data, understanding the consumer, what's important to them, who they are, how they buy, all of these things. So again, the myth is that this is just the same and we should copy and paste and kind of run similar campaigns. We disagree based on all of these things. Different audience, different environment, and this is important. You saw statistics that said, during the summer that 75% of uninsured had no idea what the Affordable Care Act was. Many didn't even know that it was passed or had not been repealed. There's a lot of misinformation, obviously, about what it is and what it isn't. And the general media environment is very hyper-partisan and political. So even people who are, aware of it are really aware of it in that context. So it's an obstacle, really, to kind of getting their attention and getting them the right education, ultimately leading them to buy the product. There's new competition. In many markets, we're working with insurers who had a majority of market share. Now they're alongside multiple competitors, and they need to think differently about how they reach customers, build their brand, and persuade them to actually enroll. New products and pricing, obviously, the qualified health plans and the tiers of qualified health plans are different than individual plans. They have different features, different functions, different pricing. New distribution channels. So obviously the web has always been a component, or in recent years, of course, been a component of outreach for health insurance enrollment. In the ACA, it is more so, mostly because the point of sale itself is online. We also have navigator programs or anything analogous to that, so in-person assistance of some kind that can help people actually navigate through this. And new outreach channels. So we believe, and obviously we have a bias here, that digital channels should have a more prominent role in outreach efforts. First of all, as I said, it's the primary point of sale. Second, the Internet itself and usage patterns on the Internet tend to correlate very well with different ACA segments, particularly young invincibles who are not watching nearly as much television, who probably don't respond to direct mail in the same way. So it requires kind of different outlets to reach them. But also general media trends. So you've all seen the graphs that say Internet usage up, television slightly flat or slightly down, I should say, etc. And the marketing channels that you relied on before aren't enough. We've seen in working with our clients and things that we've done this summer, kind of pre-enrollment and the things we're doing now, that direct mail response rates are decreasing. We believe that's a function primarily of awareness, but also a function of the different audience itself. And you can't rely on the models that you know to work in different types of markets. Paid search is a tactic we employed as well. It is a must-have for any kind of digital outreach, but it's limited in many ways because, again, if 75% of people are unaware of ACA, that means that a large percentage of them, if not all of them, are not going to be actively searching for it. So we say that paid search does a great job of responding to demand, but it does very little to generate demand, so it cannot be the only tactic. And then traditional online ad buys, which again I kind of talked about before, which could be a couple of different things. Buying specific sites, which certainly has its place. Buying specific demographic audiences, which certainly has its place, but we believe is limited in the era of the ACA, and I'll talk more about that in detail later. The wealth of data that's available has a lot of possibilities, and I've touched on those before, but it can also be confusing. How do you use it? How do you implement it? How do you interpret the analytics that we'll go through later? But we believe it's critical to long-term success and really understanding how to maximize response, how to maximize enrollment, and at the end of the day, deliver the lowest possible cost per acquisition for your ACA audience at scale. So myth number 2, marketing and outreach is failing. Response rates are lower than expected and enrollment numbers are too low. Certainly there are facts in that statement. We've all seen the preliminary numbers on healthcare.gov. Obviously the state of the site is really contributing to that low number, and there are other factors contributing to that number as well. But to make the blanket statement that marketing and outreach is failing is probably premature. In our experience, we believe that it is premature. So yes, we agree that performance metrics are below expectations. We all see the internet benchmarks, and sometimes we see performance better than that, many times a little bit lower than that. But we have to understand this. Health insurance is a complex purchase decision, even more so for people who have never had it. So I'll reference now a Google study that talked about the timeline for a decision for health insurance. And these are people who have traditionally had health insurance, so the individual market and Medicare. For the individual market, it's typically about a 2-week time frame from when they begin to search, begin to compare policies, begin to make a decision, and then ultimately enroll. For Medicare, it's a little bit longer than that. There's actually a little more research that goes into it, a little more consideration of competition, and then ultimately a decision. What we're seeing early on is that in the ACA, it's longer yet. So we need to acknowledge that. So the sub-bullet points here, again, despite the differences in the ACA market, which I touched on in the previous slide, we can't throw out 100-plus years of marketing knowledge. We can't throw out 10,000 years of human psychology knowledge and just assume that we can start marketing and people will sign up and everything will be good. The consumer decision journey here does not start with enrollment. It's the basic funnel, and I'm kind of simplifying it here, but you have to build awareness, you have to build education, you have to build engagement, and you have to build enrollment. We have spoken with agencies, we have spoken with clients who obviously have political pressure and other pressure to drive very large volume. And we certainly believe that we can help that with what we do and certainly things that other vendors can do. But to ignore the fact that there is a process, there is a timeline that we really can't ignore is a problem. So we need to kind of focus that. And then apply the right marketing tactic to this audience based on where they are in their decision journey. So again, don't just start with very focused direct response and expect people to enroll. These things can be done concurrently, but awareness has to be part of that. So we talk about segmented and sequential messaging. Segmented based on the data. So again, a young invincible sees something different than potentially an older person would. But also sequential. One of the things that we've learned is the incremental value of an additional impression in terms of awareness or engagement decays to almost zero at about 10 to 12 impressions. So that means you can't just keep serving the same message. And rather than just serve a different message, serve a sequential message that kind of corresponds with the actual process. So build awareness, build engagement, build enrollment. But also multi-channel messaging. So we have seen that certain channels do a great job of awareness, for example, online video, but it doesn't do such a great job of conversion. Mobile's another good example of that, particularly in certain segments. And then align your KPIs based on where your customers are in the process. So for awareness, we talk in terms of targeted reach, not just reach. Any vendor can give you impressions at a very low CPM and find very many people. But we speak in terms of targeted reach so that we're not just serving impressions, we're serving impressions to uninsured people in your segment. And we can measure the effectiveness that we do that. So my parenthetical phrase here is all CPMs are not created equal. You really have to think about what is the targeted CPM and therefore the targeted reach. And ditto for engagement. We speak in terms of targeted clicks, not just click-through rate. So a couple of things that I can kind of color commentary on that point. One is we see a lot of click fraud. We were working on one very large campaign that was using a vendor to measure clicks. Our click-through rate was much lower. We actually highlighted the fact that the vendor who was managing or viewing kind of the click-through rate was over-reporting by a factor of 6x, which sounds unbelievable, but that was all due to fraud. So you need to make sure that the clicks you're getting are not fraudulent clicks. It exists. There are ways to filter it out, and you need to make sure that your reports show that. But another example of that is unqualified clicks. So you see a Pew Research report that was released last week that estimates that 70% of the visitors to healthcare.gov were already insured. Now, I assume that includes a lot of people on this call, and myself, of course, just out of curiosity, kind of looking to see what it was, and of course reporters and politicians. But the reality is that the vast majority of people going to the site were not qualified in terms of enrolling because they were already insured. That's a lot of waste. So you need to think in terms of qualified reach and targeted engagement and targeted clicks. And then enrollment. The key here is really understanding the full attribution model, not just last click attribution. An example of that I'll say is, as I mentioned before, paid search does a great job of driving conversion events, whether that's lead generation or account creation or even enrollment, but a lot of things lead into that. So display advertising can provide a lift on paid search because it increases awareness and then therefore increases inquiries. Branded searches, quality score, all of those things increases the ROI on search. So we look in terms of a multi-channel attribution model, not just the last click. If you focus on the latter, your conclusion may seem to be, well, we should only be doing paid search. And we believe that that's only part of the story here. And then something that I'll say a couple times today is be patient, test, learn, and optimize. So be patient. I realize that's easy for me to say in many cases. But the reality is this. This will take time. We've seen a number of studies, which I'll refer to on the next slide, that say people are just kind of waiting this out for one of many reasons. But we can learn from what we've seen so far, which is what we'll get into next. We can optimize based on that, and we can make sure that we're spending our money as effectively as possible to reach this market. So the third and final myth is that the underwriting mix is not viable. The young invincibles are not engaging and probably never will. In reality, I say maybe, but I think that this is probably overemphasized. I don't think the problem is as big as expected, and I think that there are some points of light here whereby we can reach this audience and ultimately convert this audience and get the mix where it needs to be. So, for example, the early enrollees, we've seen Wall Street Journal reports that say in some cases 90% plus, in some cases close to 100%, have been Medicaid respondees. The older audiences tend to respond first. I think we can all agree that this, to some extent, is natural and intuitive, and that we would expect these audiences to be the first to enroll because they've been waiting a long time for the opportunity to do so. But we can also influence what we do from here, and we can influence that ratio to make sure it's more positive and that the underwriting mix works. So, for example, I've mentioned imprecision in targeting. We get RFPs from agencies, we get in discussions with insurers, and their general point of view is, they want to target, for example, people below $60,000 income. And that's the point that I'd like to make first. The difference between household income and federal poverty level is important because federal poverty level also includes household size. So if you make $60,000, you may or may not be subsidy eligible, and you should probably be targeted in a different way. So we try to correct the thinking when we work with clients to think in terms of FPL, because that's really what's driving where you fall in terms of Medicaid, in terms of subsidies, in terms of above subsidy eligible. Contextual targeting has been many times limited to healthcare-based sites. I'll show you a slide later that shows what we're actually seeing in terms of the types of sites that are working, but what you'll see very starkly is that if you focus just on healthcare-based sites, first of all, you're missing the vast majority of your audience. Many of them will never go to a healthcare site. Second, people who go to healthcare sites, WebMD, for example, will tend to be more engaged in their health, but also more likely to have some kind of chronic condition or some kind of sickness. So the fact that people are actively targeting this group of people, not that we ignore them completely, and we do not, but you should focus more on the audiences that you are interested in enrolling and focus more on younger people, young invincible, subsidy eligible, all of these things. So we did some testing in the summer around this, and we did learn this. So we learned that young invincibles required more impressions, more time, just more time on the calendar, and more ad impressions served to them before they would engage. And in the summer, obviously, it wasn't enrollment. It was things like info request, seminars, just engagement with the page, etc. But when we compared what it took for a young invincible, as we've defined it, to take that act versus an older population or even a Medicaid expansion population, it just took more time and more impressions. So that really needs to be understood. The last bullet point talks about a Gallup poll that was released last week that talks about 18% of uninsured adults have attempted to go to an exchange. Probably, based on the news, the vast majority of that percentage unsuccessfully. However, again, there are some points of light. 44% expect to go to an exchange, so the vast majority who intend to have not. But also 25% of uninsured adults expect to pay the fine. And according to this graph here, roughly 70% expect to enroll at some point. So there absolutely is a market that just has not moved yet. And in fact, Gallup's own conclusion here, which I have as the last bullet point, are that Americans are waiting to try out the health exchange websites until their highly publicized problems are fixed. This may take some time. We've seen news today that indicates that very thing. Or they may simply be putting off decisions about getting insurance till later. It was a while ago that I was 27 years old, but I can remember at that time, and I can assure you that when I enrolled, which I probably would have done, it would have been at the last minute. So the conclusion here is yes, the initial results are not the mix that we want, but part of that is just natural kind of human nature, and part of that is the design of the strategies and the execution that we're reaching these people, and those strategies need to reflect the people that we actually want to enroll. So the next few slides are going to talk about what we've seen so far. So I mentioned that we're running a couple dozen campaigns, again, for a variety of clients. This slide just shows a basic summary of that. We've served, upwards of 100 million impressions in the month of October, an average of 8 million each for state and federal exchanges, an average of about 2 million for private insurers. Our average audience size is about 390,000, so obviously that's going to fluctuate greatly depending on the geography and depending on the specific segment of uninsured. But what we've seen is, and we can measure this through our platform, the average user has seen 15 exchange ads per viewer and 13 insurance ads per viewer. That sounds like a lot, but when you think about how many internet ads you see in a given day, that's really a very small fraction. But the other point of that is we've already surpassed what we see as kind of the benchmark for where serving additional impressions has no additional or incremental value. So this is the point where we would recommend putting new creative in, refreshing new creative, and not just randomly new creative, some kind of sequential creative that builds on the message that was already said. Some of our clients are doing this. Some of our clients are handcuffed for whatever reason and relying on one creative. As we talk about best practices, one of our absolute recommendations is get multiple creative, make it sequential, and then average somewhere about 10 to 12 impressions before you cycle it through. You will see better response. You will see incremental response based on that. So the next few slides are going to talk about, very high level, what have we seen across all campaigns. And the point of these slides is not so much, silver bullets. We're not going to say, hey, this part of the bar chart is through the roof, so focus all of your spend on that. First of all, it's not practical. We all have different objectives here. Second of all, it doesn't make marketing sense because we're still very early on. And, to make fully statistically valid conclusions at this stage is premature. However, we can see directionally, what we see is working. We can make optimization to make sure that it works better, and we can invest in those channels and audiences and day parts and all the things that you'll see to make sure that we're doing better. So, for example, if I can be 5% better with this audience and 8% better on this day and 6% better on this site context, those things start to add up, and the aggregate percentage improvement becomes very meaningful, and that's when we scale and we can really see the best results. So this slide here, what we've seen so far is who is engaging. And we're going to define engaging right now in a fairly crude way, which is clicks. Clicks are a proxy, sort of interim metric. It has directional value. It's not the only value. Ultimately, we would like to say who is converting, but obviously because of the issues with healthcare.gov and some of the other exchanges and some of the data that we have access to, we don't have a critical mass of data to really kind of predict that with any certainty. But just to make the point, right now we're focusing on who is engaging. We will be focusing on who is converting concurrently and then more proportionally as we go continue down these campaigns. What we've included on this slide is a number of segments, and you'll see that there's overlap between the segments, but we wanted to show we can be very granular with how we define a segment. So over-indexing segments, first of all, green represents exchanges, blue represents insurers. You'll see some differences there. Some were running to both, some were only running to one or the other. The index, the line at 0 is the index, which is the average response or click-through rate. A bar above that obviously is higher proportionally, and a bar below that is lower proportionally. So you can start to see specific segments that are responding. For example, African American women, uninsured, age 18 to 34, have an excellent response rate, significantly higher than any of the other segments that we've seen. Their conversion rate is proportionally better, not to this extent, and again, it's very early on to tell that, but what we can see is this is an audience that is responding. Our conclusion from that is that our targeting is working. The messaging that we give, the images that we put in the ad, the call to action that we give are specifically based on the psychographics of this segment, and we're seeing that they respond very well. Other segments that you see over index, you'll see some things in mobile and you'll see some things in video. Again, in the early stages, awareness and education, which is primarily where we are right now, those are great channels for outreach, and that will be one of our tactical recommendations at the end. Both of them, however, have limitations in terms of conversion. Video is great. Our benchmark completion rates are much higher than industry average. Our click-through rates for video are much higher than industry average, and mobile as well. But video doesn't do such a great job of conversion. Mobile could do that. However, we're confined to some extent by the conversion itself. In other words, healthcare.gov, the mobile version of the website or the mobile version of the exchange websites are not necessarily as conducive to conversion, and in fact there is no marketplace online or on mobile for healthcare.gov. So you got to think about the right channel at the right time. My conclusion from this graph is there are certain segments that are responding well, there are others that intuitively are not. We can take a look on a very granular basis at this and start to draw conclusions. And again, this slide focuses on who, which is just one of the dimensions that we measure as part of what we do. The next slide shows when are they engaging. So this is an aggregate chart. We can and have, in fact, segmented this chart by multiple types of segments. So, for example, if I showed you this chart for young Hispanic males, or if I showed you this chart for subsidy eligible versus Medicaid, or if I showed you this chart for the state of Texas versus the state of Illinois, it would look different. But my point with this is not, oh, look at that big orange bar, we must do everything on Monday because that will work. In aggregate, though, that is absolutely the trend. With roughly proportional impression volumes, we are seeing, Sunday, by the way, is the average, so there's no bar there. That's kind of a benchmark index. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays are overperforming. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays are underperforming, and Sunday is kind of the benchmark that we set there. Again, we can segment this, and we have, and we will continue to do so, where we can say for young Hispanic males, this day is the best day. The point of this slide is the capability is there to measure this very quickly. The capability is there to analyze this very quickly and then act very quickly. So we have already, in our campaigns, taken a look at specific campaigns and the requirements of those campaigns and said, you're getting better response on this day. The other dimension that's not shown on this graph is time of day. And we've got data on that as well that says certain hours and day parts perform very well with certain segments. And again, it's just one of many levers that we're going to talk through over the next few minutes that we can hit. The goal is improve this by 8%, this by 10%, and then at the end of the day, you're just optimized on multiple fronts. So this is when are they engaging. The next slide shows where are they engaging, and this is kind of an interesting slide to me because I get in the debate often when we talk to agencies or exchanges who want to be on certain sites. Our premise is we follow the audience wherever they are. Obviously, every ad we serve is on a brand safe site, above the fold, all of those things. But we try to include as broad a reach as possible on the where. So rather than say, and we get this request all the time, what is your site list? Or can you restrict only to healthcare sites or health, related sites? Our answer is yes, but we would advise against that, particularly for the reasons I mentioned before. Awareness is very low. If you're only focusing on a specific category of sites, you're going to miss the vast majority of your audience. A couple of things that I think are interesting on this graph, and this shows relative proportion in terms of engagement, which here is clicks. Health sites is this very small purple circle kind of right underneath the red one, is about 2%. So we're not getting great engagement from healthcare sites. We're not serving overly proportional to them, but we talk to many clients who believe that that's the only place we should be serving. So I think that small purple circle is an illustration of why that's probably not a best practice. A couple other things, news sites, which is in the bottom left corner, is at 15%. We're getting good response there, but my caveat there, and I say this to clients all the time, is you need to be careful and you need to do things like contextual matching and negative matching, because many times you don't want the ad for your company or your exchange to be right by an article that's talking about what a train wreck Obamacare is. Go to a healthcare site or a news site right now and look at an article. You'll probably see an ad. I would argue that that's not the best placement for an ad, but news sites absolutely need to be in the mix. But the two biggest circles, or actually the first and third biggest circle, the biggest is entertainment. And we've had clients say, we don't want to be on entertainment sites. But not only are we finding uninsured on these sites, the uninsured are engaging on these sites. And in some cases, in specific demographics, certainly younger, we're seeing in the Hispanic and African American demographics as well, are very highly over-indexing response on entertainment-based sites. So the takeaway from this is don't narrow your site context too low. Certainly, specific site buys have a place. We can do it, other vendors can do it, but it can't be the only part of your tactic, because again, in the stage right now is cast as wide a net as possible, do so intelligently by finding the right people, but find them wherever they are. And I think this graph does a good job of showing it, because even the small circles, you'll see there's 20 or so different categories of sites here, and we're getting response from each. Some better than others, and those some that are better than others are sometimes the sites that we're asked explicitly to avoid. So it's just something to consider as you think about where you're going to be serving your ads. And then what are they engaging with? So I have a couple of slides here on creative. And again, I'll say that my point with this slide is not, for example, if you look at the bottom right, blue button color is highly outperforming other button colors. It's not my suggestion that, I've solved your problem, make the buttons blue, we can all go home early. My point with this is there are multiple things to measure, and you should consider all of these as you test and optimize. We've worked with a lot of different exchanges who have one set of creative and they don't change it. We believe that's bad for multiple reasons, some of which I've already mentioned, but one of them is it doesn't let you test granular things like this. So when we think of creative, we don't just think of, a banner ad. There's multiple things we look at. So on this slide, and there's actually a couple others on the next slide, we look at message, we look at call to action, we look at imagery, and we look at button color. So that's shown on the top right, and I've used a kind of a generic ad. FreshBooks is not our client, but I didn't want to show a specific client ad. We're prohibited from doing that in many cases. I just wanted to show you what we mean by each of those categories. So what we've done, and we assessed hundreds and hundreds of different ads that we are currently serving, we've tried to group them into categories, and we start to see trends. So again, we do this analysis not just for each individual client, but for specific segments within each individual client. And we can come to conclusions that say, for example, this type of imagery with families and couples highly outperforms ads with just words, or ads with some kind of stock imagery, or things that talk to specific things like pregnancy or injury. The message itself, you can see the ones that over-index and you can see the ones that under-index a little bit. By the way, the darkness of the line itself will show you how many ads we've served using that specific category of creative. So our conclusion with this would be, for example, start to consider messages like choose us, are you ready, even competitive ads, and put more of your spend into those, because early on they are over-indexing. Again, it's not a recommendation to push everything there. It's a recommendation to test and optimize, continuously learn, and then scale. So again, we measure creative very granularly, and there's 4 things that we show here, and we can see very dramatic differences in terms of what types of things are working. We do this for our clients very specifically because each client is different, their segments are different, but the point is that we measure all of those things. Digital channels in general allow you to measure all these things and optimize accordingly. So the next slide shows some additional aspects of creative. So in this case specifically ad size. There are many different types of ad units that you can have on the web, through display, through even video, different ad units. So what you'll see here, again, the darkness of the color shows where we're concentrating ads, and you see a bit of a disconnect. The 728 by 90, which is sort of the top masthead ad, a lot of people are creating these ads, and we're serving a lot of these ads because that's the inventory we have. They're underperforming based on the average, certainly relative to some ad units. For example, 300 by 600 is a tremendously performing ad. In some cases, 20, 30x the response. Now, it's not as simple as just throw everything into that ad size because there's limited inventory. But it is a reasonable conclusion to say we need to maximize our reach through that size. And frankly, many of the agencies and customers we're working with just don't supply us with that ad unit. So what we do is we look at a chart like this, and we go back and say, based on the data, we're seeing that this ad type unit is doing better. We should maximize the reach with this ad, and the campaign will perform better. So again, it's just another dimension of how we look at creative. And I can't say this enough. Creative is very important. It should be sequential. It should be tested. It should be refreshed. More often than not, none of those things are being done among our clients. It's just, here's our ad. Let's serve it until we're done. And we believe that that's probably not a good idea. So example campaign results. This is a regional private insurer, one with very strong brand awareness and very high market share in their particular region, I should say. And I realize with the people on this call, this is not always the case. There are co-ops, there are startups, there are smaller insurance companies, there are exchanges themselves that don't, and advocacy groups that don't have this level of brand awareness. So, there's not much we can do about that except help you build that as we go through the campaign. We were able to test during the summer of 2013, and we did some things right around open enrollment to test all of these things that I've said. We test the who, the granular audience segments to see who's responding. Young men, 18 to 34, women, age 40 to 64, et cetera, et cetera. What creative is working with each group? What call to action is working with each group? Obviously, we can't turn back the clock and say, all right, let's go back to July and start testing all this. But we do have several months left in enrollment, and in fact, many of you have probably heard whispers that we probably will have till May, maybe, maybe not, but we certainly have through the end of March to go through this enrollment period, so there is time to test these things. Another best practice that they exhibited was integrating multiple tactics. As I mentioned before, we can handle display, we can handle search, social, retargeting, and we also do something called digital direct mail, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But it was multiple tactics, and really synchronizing those tactics in terms of creative, in terms of time, in terms of who receives what ad through what channel, and we really designed the campaign to reach across those channels. There was a lot of retargeting and conversion tracking in place, and I can't emphasize this enough. Some of our clients don't do retargeting. Some of them are not allowed. Some of them think it's illegal or unethical. It is certainly neither of the latter. It is also certainly one of the best performing tactics, and in many cases, the vast majority of conversions that we see are done through retargeting. It's a very low-cost way to kind of control frequency and sequence of messaging and get people who have demonstrated an intent to act. And then conversion tracking, which is we don't just want to measure clicks. That's very easy, and we certainly do that. We want to see what they're doing on the site. What are they engaging with? Are they filling out the form? Are they filling out an application? Some of our clients, including this one, have that in place. Some of them don't. When it is in place, we can do things like optimize based on that event. So it's not our goal, and it should not be your goal, to get as many clicks as possible. I've talked about kind of the reasons for that before. You should optimize on conversion, whether that's lead generation or enrollment. We can do it, but you have to have the specific tracking in place, and sometimes that's not as easy as it sounds like. Multiple streamlined landing pages. A lot of times we'll do an ad campaign and kind of throw someone into the middle of a website, and there's a bunch of information, but it's not clear exactly what you intend them to do. If you focus the landing page to a specific call of action, give us your name, your email, your zip code, whatever that may be, we've seen much better conversion results, and we can track them individually by segment. Call center integration and tracking. So obviously with the problems with healthcare.gov, this has been an issue. So we can integrate with a call center, divert some of the traffic there, but also through unique numbers, measure the effectiveness of the campaigns that drove them there. Again, test, learn, and optimize. The results, very good. The effective CPM is $8, which is higher than many of you may be spending in some cases. The click-through rate is 0.05%, which may be lower than you're seeing in many cases. However, at the end of the day, those really don't matter as much as the cost per lead and the cost per acquisition, which in this case is enrollment. We're seeing $10 leads, $130 acquisition for this particular client. To contrast that in their individual healthcare market, and we've been working with this client for years in that regard, their cost per acquisition is $80 to $90. So in the ACA world, it's more. That's a function of it's early, awareness is not good, and we haven't optimized. But these are the bottom line results that we can drive if we do some of the things that we mentioned before. So, again, the point of those slides was just to show you all the different things we can measure in a very granular way. The next 3 or 4 slides will just talk about, what does this mean to you? Analytics are nice and they're pretty pictures, but what can you do with them? So here's some tactical recommendations and best practices that we would say based on what we've seen so far. So number 1, use data to maximize targeted reach across your core audience. So uninsured in this case, in the context of this discussion, you'd be surprised potentially how often we receive requests that don't include that word. They're looking for Hispanic males age 18 to 34 because that may correlate highly with uninsured, but we're looking for uninsured. So the 2 circles you see there are the core audience that we can reach, the small green one, is uninsured, but also supplement that with broader demographic targeting. Use both so that you can push on the edges a little bit, because we'll start to see, first of all, people who may be newly uninsured, but also different demographic groups that are not directly represented in our data that are interested in your product. And the idea is focus on both proportionally, find out who's actually responding, and let that define who is your core audience. And then align your tactics with who your customer is. Again, that's our basic approach, but also where they are in the decision process. I've mentioned some of these things before. Online video is great for awareness. We're seeing great response in terms of completion rates, in terms of click-through rates, but it's not so great for conversion. So heavy up on video early on, but kind of phase that out as you move more towards enrollment. And do these things concurrently. Targeted mobile is performing very well, particularly in the younger markets and in some minority segments, as I've mentioned before. Probably fairly intuitive just based on media usage patterns. But again, the conversion there is difficult. We've addressed that in a way that I'll show on another slide, that you can do things with mobile ad units that can actually help convert. Diversify site context. That's referring back to the slide with all of the circles. Don't be too narrow there. You need to expand your reach and let the data tell you who is responding and then adjust accordingly. Social media. A lot of people think Facebook's not the greatest tool for conversion. That's correct, but it is good at branding. The reach is very broad, and there are ancillary benefits which help the top of the funnel, things like likes and things like sharing, which help build a connection that you can kind of cultivate over time. And then paid search is a must. It absolutely has to be part of your digital campaign, but again, it responds to demand. It does not create it. So these tactics, you really need to think about, where you are in your customer's process, finding the right mix of these things, and I would suggest to the extent possible, including all of these things to a certain extent, and then changing that mix as you start to see results. Next slide, I referred before to something called digital direct mail. So we focus exclusively online, but offline, obviously direct mail still has its place. What we can do, many of you invest a lot of money in building an audience for direct mail purposes. We can actually match that audience through our process to a one-to-one match to an online audience. So if it's Joe Smith at 123 Main Street, we will drop a cookie on his device. All of the PII is stripped out, so we don't know it's Joe Smith at 123 Main Street, but we do know that he's on your list and in whatever segment, and that he's about to get a piece of mail from you. So when we synchronize a digital campaign to this, we start serving digital ads to the same people who will be receiving mail. We start a few days before, we go a few days after, and what we found is very interesting. It delivers conversions directly through digital channels, which is good, but it also provides a lift on direct mail response rates because there's more awareness, they're more likely to open it, more likely to respond to it, and in some cases we've seen 30% or more in terms of lift on direct mail response rates. So this is something that's definitely possible and something that you should probably consider as one of your tactics, because direct mail is expensive. Digital media is much less expensive. We can serve dozens and dozens and dozens of ads for the cost of a stamp, and the lift makes that investment worthwhile. A couple of other things. I'm just checking the time here. Retargeting pixels and leveraging them responsibly. So we've talked to clients that are not allowed to do that, as I mentioned, or people who think it's illegal or unethical. It is HIPAA compliant. It is online privacy compliant. Really what we try to do is manage what we call the creepy factor, so we don't inundate people with a bunch of retargeting ads. When I looked at a pair of sneakers on Amazon and didn't buy them, I saw a lot of ads for that sneaker over the next several weeks, and it became a little bit too much. So we manage frequency, we manage sequence of ads, and we also make opt-out highly visible. But it is an effective tactic. It's very easy to implement. It is a low-cost tactic and should be part of what you do. Leverage tracking and conversion pixels. Again, that allows us to optimize based on the events that are actually important. We can get you clicks all day long. If they're not the right clicks, it really just doesn't matter. What you ultimately need are leads and then applications and enrollment. And tracking and conversion pixels allow us to optimize based on that. Refresh creative, I've said it many times, make it segmented based on your audience and sequential. The first bullet point should say incremental message effectiveness approaches 0 after 10 to 12 impressions. So don't serve 50 impressions to the same person, because on average 40 of those are completely wasted. And then A/B test those by segment and then optimize. And then for enrollment, align the call to action starting on the banner and then moving to a streamlined landing page or website. Be very, very focused on the act that you want them to do. Again, a lot of our customers send them to a home page or a site where there's many things that they can do, and they wonder, well, why are they not filling out the account form? And our response is because there's 100 other things on that page that are distracting them. You need to keep it very simple, very streamlined, and when we do so, we see much better results. And then the last tactical recommendation is, is your website broken? Consider alternative consumer paths. I mentioned specific ad units we can do, for example, in mobile, that can do a couple of things. We can direct people to a call center directly with click-to-call. We've seen very good cost per quality call, which is a 60-second or longer call when we do that. We can also connect people directly, and that's what you see in the bottom half with the maps, to navigators. There's been a lot of money spent on navigators, but not a lot of outreach from the navigators. You can drive people to in-person assistance, whether that's a navigator or some other representative or broker. You can do that in the ad unit itself. So this is something that we've done successfully in a couple of campaigns, and it addresses the question of the young invincible specifically, who are on mobile, who are engaging on mobile, but don't have anything to do once they're there. And then on the right side of the screen says, be ready for the inevitable new consumer paths. This was taken from the New York Times, and certainly you've heard the rumors that there's been a lot of pressure from insurers for a way around healthcare.gov. So can we convert through our own channel and do an API with the subsidy calculator, et cetera? That is inevitable. And at some point, that will be a path for this because it has to be. So be ready for that. And make sure that your website is ready for that and can handle the volume for that. And then lastly, test, learn, optimize, and scale. So what this graph shows is a number of campaigns that we've run. You can see low volume, and then the line is actually click-through rate. And as you see, once we learn all of these things, who's responding, where, when, how, what context, then we scale. And as you see, the line becomes proportionally better in terms of clicks and engagement before we scale, and that's really where we want to end up. So let me just check the time here. We've got about 5 minutes, sorry about that, for questions and discussion. I just want to make the point. First of all, this is my contact information. I've already seen some questions about, is this presentation going to be available? The answer is yes. Everyone who's registered will receive a link to this presentation. Also, I'd just like to mention that Audience Partners will be at the Health Insurance Exchange Show at the ARIA in Las Vegas next week. So if you'd like to chat with me or any of my colleagues, we will be there. We will be presenting there. We'll be glad to talk to you specifically about what you're doing. And then this is my email and phone number. Please feel free at any time to reach out to me. I'd be glad to just talk philosophically with you. I would be glad to take a look at specifically what you're doing, and with no commitment, obviously, and no cost. I would be glad to tell you, my recommendations on specifically what you guys should be doing. So we've got a few questions here. If you have questions now, we've got a couple of minutes left. Please submit them, and I can kind of address those one by one. The first question is, will we be sending out slides? And I've already addressed that. The next question talks about pricing structure. So this is a good question. We get this question all the time. So our basic pricing structure is on a CPM level. And the CPMs, will typically be higher than what you might see for a run of network or you might see through Google AdWords. And the reason is all the things that I've said so far. We focus only on uninsured. So rather than 70% of your clicks being people who are not eligible for your product, we have validated our data and our audience at somewhere between 85 and 90% accurate, meaning we know with that precision that they are uninsured, that they are within this age range, income range, ethnicity, etc. We have validated first-party data that we use for that. It is not modeled. It is not behavioral. So we can say that with precision. That said, as we work through projects with a client, as we understand the specifics of their market, of their audience, of their creative, of their messaging, we can and have moved to a different type of model, whether that's a CPA model, whether that's a cost per click model, or whether that's a continued CPM model. As long as at the end of the day, the bottom line results are working, that is absolutely what we're focused on, and certainly that is what our clients are focused on. Let me see here. So here's a question. How are you making sure any testing you are doing today will be useful during the 3 phases in 2014? So I think it's a good question, and again, I kind of put the caveats in place. First of all, it's a function of critical mass. We need to make sure that we've seen enough data within each individual segment before we can make conclusions on how to scale it. In some cases we have done that, and in some cases we haven't. But we believe that we're testing all of the right things. So I started out by talking about the variables within the ACA audience. They're different people. They have different awareness, different concerns, different products. These are all the things that we're using as our benchmark. So when we test, we are testing specifically ACA audience segments relative to ACA products and how they are purchasing them. So, you refer to the next few phases, obviously open enrollment, the first part, and then sort of the lull between the next enrollment period and then ongoing. We believe that certainly by the end of enrollment, because we've already seen enough now, we'll have the right level of data and a critical mass of that data. So we won't be making a lot of assumptions. We will be able to say with certainty, this is how young Hispanic females are interacting with this. This is how they are engaging with the product, and this is how they are buying. Obviously, as we move into next year, there are things that we don't know. Will the healthcare.gov website work? Will there be political pressures that we don't foresee? Will there be other external events that we don't foresee? We can never control for that, but we believe that we're controlling for all the factors specific with this audience, and then we can make adjustments. So again, phase 1, as you've defined it, open enrollment. We can apply the learning from the first phase of enrollment with some adjustments. During the summer period, which I'm glad you asked, we don't expect that anyone should just go dark during that period. We would recommend, and in fact have recommended, kind of continued a lower level of awareness among the key audiences that we have identified to need that are in that stage of the funnel. And then obviously next year we'll be much better teed up for enrollment itself. And we've got a couple more questions, and I know we're pushing up against time, so I will answer one more question, which is specifically about mobile and prepaid. So that's a good question. I didn't touch on that. We do include prepaid mobile as part of what we do. There are some obvious correlations with certain demographics of uninsured with prepaid mobile. There's a large percentage, and that's really their only connection to the Internet. So we use it. The cost of the inventory is fairly low. The targeting can be just as precise as what I've talked about here. The limitations, though, are really on functionality. So what do you do with that person? Where does that ad take them? It's not, like an iPhone where there's the interactivity and the quickness and all of those things. So we can absolutely do it. It's certainly part of what we recommend. Excuse me. It's lower cost, but what we typically do is we use that as an awareness tool, and we'll typically use that to drive people to a call center, potentially in-person assistance, or at least make them aware of the website, whatever that may be, that they can go to if and when they go to a computer. A couple more sort of ancillary notes about mobile. iPhones and non-iPhones, we've seen stark differences between what performs on each. Android phones are seeing much better response. We believe that's a function of a couple of things. One, very practical. A lot of the ad units we get are flash and don't function on an iPhone. But also the demographic makeup of Android users correlates more highly with uninsured. So we're seeing better reach, we're seeing better response, we're seeing better engagement. That said, we can do some things. We actually work with Apple on what they call iAds. Some of the interactive ad units that I showed you before, that was the tactic that we were using specifically for iPhones. You can do a lot of very interesting things in the ad unit itself. So we're doing things like showing a video. We're doing things like set yourself a reminder to enroll or for a specific event. We're doing things like here's an email that you can share with your friend. And, you know, as a focus group of one, I would look at those things and say, well, I may or may not do that, but we're actually seeing a lot of people use those features. More importantly, click here to call, directly to the call center, circumvent the website. Obviously, call centers have their own issues, but we're seeing a lot of those things in the iPhone environment. So, again, prepaid, which was the specific question, absolutely a good tactic. You just have to understand that you're limited somewhat in terms of what you can do through that channel, and you should consider the limitations of different mobile devices, whether that's an iPad, iPhone, feature phone, Android phone, because again, it's a different market looking at it, and different tactics should apply, and different ad units, et cetera, should apply. So we've got a couple more questions, but we are out of time. I'm actually a little bit over right now. So what I will do is this. I will summarize the answers to these questions, and I will respond to them and follow up directly with people on the webinar. Again, the slide that you see right now has my contact information and my phone number and our website. Please feel free to reach out. We would be glad to talk to you specifically about what you're doing. And again, this is important to me, so I would be glad to spend time talking to you about, you know, what we've seen specifically as it relates to your audience and how either potentially we can help or just potentially make your campaign better in some way. So thanks for your time. Again, I hope to see you next week in Las Vegas and hope to hear from you soon.